Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game. So, taking out a super fun and super exciting episode for you guys today because I'm doing part 2 of the Analogue 3D Overclocking Showcase. You guys want to see a lot more games tested, so I'm going over 5 more of the games that I think absolutely benefit from being overclocked on N64 hardware, because some of the games back in the day were absolute slideshows, and even though they were pretty to look at, they were never that fun to play just because you had to fight with the frame rate. So we're going to be getting into 5 games that I think are just that much better. Before you get far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. If you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, got a Patreon link down below as well. But obviously this should be clear to everyone, we are playing Perfect Dark right now, but we're actually not playing the stock Perfect Dark ROM or the cartridge. This has been patched with a performance patch that on real N64 hardware would allow it to run faster by fixing up some code issues. You throw an overclock on top of that and you get a game that can almost lock to 60 frames per second in certain spots. Obviously just sitting here you can see that head sway, and as the elevator comes up, that is absolutely the most fluid footage you're ever going to see of Perfect Dark as far as FPGA is concerned, unless you're using MiSTer FPGA. But there are a few patches out there for games that will improve the overall performance, and this is the only one that's going to be patched on this video. The other 4 are going to be stock as far as how they shipped out of the box. But that really shows just how far people have gone to improve the performance on N64, even outside of FPGA gaming. And that really shows that as time goes on, developers and ROM hackers find out more about the hardware and the underlying code, and they're able to make games that just run better on N64 hardware than developers were able to do back in the day. And that is just something that comes with time and more modern tool sets when you're actually developing N64 games. But of course, if you throw something like an overclocked N64 FPGA core at it, clocking up all of the different chips as far as what's inside of an N64 is concerned, you get a situation where Perfect Dark really feels like it's running on a GameCube just with N64 graphics. This makes this game infinitely more playable because on stock N64 hardware, on the stock MiSTer FPGA core or Analogue 3D without any of the overclocks turned on original hardware mode, I honestly find the game near unplayable at this point in time. It's one of those things, sure we're getting a PC port of it and it's going to get some new graphics sometime soon, but it's one of those things, if you want to go back to the original geometry and the original look, but you want it to play more like an actual video game and less like a slideshow, something like the performance patch here absolutely gives you the best of both worlds, and we should all be so happy that we're actually able to do something like this on FPGA hardware. And as we move into the second level here again, just look at the fluidity in that head bob. That's one of the easiest ways to tell outside of the enemy animations. You are just seeing so many more frames per second than you'd ever see on real hardware. And because the animations are basically tied to the frame rate as well, the characters are going to move a little bit more fluidly. Even the door moving and the reload animation is just going to be that much better. And it absolutely makes a huge difference as far as the playability of this game is concerned. It is absolutely one of the best first-person shooters of its era, where 100% made an amazing spiritual sequel to something like GoldenEye. They just made it on hardware that was way too old at that point in time, and probably should have kept Perfect Dark to be a GameCube launch game and not an end-of-life N64 game. But it goes to show the N64 could have some really pretty graphics when it actually has decent clock speeds behind it so that the game will run at the frame rate that you would hope it would run. It just becomes that much better of a time. And in my opinion personally, the only way to play the original N64 game is going to be with an overclock on an FPGA core somehow, unless you want to play the PC port of the game. Now keeping with the first-person shooter theme, here we're going to go to Turok 3. This game absolutely, just like Perfect Dark, felt like something that should have been a GameCube launch title and not an end-of-life N64 title, because this game plays completely different than the first 2 Turok games in a lot of ways, and it kind of feels really inspired by Half-Life, which is a good game to take inspiration from. But this game would run in some instances even worse than something like Perfect Dark, and I would definitely say on real hardware, when I played this back in the day, I was absolutely disappointed because I did have a PC that could run Half-Life, so going to something like the N64, sure in screenshots, it looked pretty and felt like it could get kind of close to what a PC could do, at least in the medium spec range. When you actually played it, you realized that getting 60 frames per second out of your PC at home playing Half-Life was a hell of a lot better than trying to play Turok 3. But now you're definitely going to see it is a lot smoother. This is not going to get up to the 60 frame territory unless you're just looking at a wall turning the camera, but it gets close to like 45 frames per second. And let's move into the first quote-unquote soundtrack sample, more like ephemeral audio, and I'll be right back with a lot more games.
Please don't hurt me! Follow me! It's right up here! Hurry! We can get up to the
So let's run down the checklist. Does it look like Turok 3? Yes, it does. Does it sound like Turok 3? Yes, it does. Does it run like dog shit on N64 original hardware Turok 3 style? It does not. That is the big difference here. The Analogue 3D is clearly for people that have nostalgia for N64, and it might even be for N64 collectors, but for the people out there that haven't played Turok in 5, 10, 15, 20 some odd years, your nostalgia may be fooling you into remembering the game a little bit faster and a little bit better than it was. Turok 3 is a lot of fun, it's got a great design, and it's got a lot of fun gameplay aesthetics going on, but you put me in front of a real N64 and you tell me to play Turok 3 and I'm absolutely going to be driven nuts by its poor performance, but now on something like Analogue 3D with the highest turbo overclocks, you're going to be able to get a really playable experience, and that is what really matters, bringing these games from being something that will drive you insane to being something that'll definitely be way more playable, enjoyable for a ton of years to come, and we absolutely love that. Now moving over to the next game, if you can't tell already, there is a theme today, and in my opinion it is games that should have been held for GameCube launch titles and not published on N64. If you can't tell also already, you're going to see a little bit of Rare in here because they absolutely push the limits of the N64 hardware, and in instances like Jet Force Gemini, I think they push just a little bit too hard because this is another game where it just absolutely can bog down in the performance department. I wouldn't say it's as bad as Turok 3, and it definitely is still playable, but anything with more frames per second is just going to be a more fun experience, and that's exactly what you're going to get here out of the Analogue 3D. So again, all of these tests are pushing the overclock as far as it can go to the right. These aren't the more limited tests, and that's what I would recommend for everyone, because in all of my testing I really didn't have any issues on any of the games. But do remember, if a game crashes when you're on overclock or it has visual glitches or audio glitches, that is expected. The only thing that is looking for accuracy on Analogue 3D is going to be the stock console mode, and anything else deviating from that can and will present some weirdness every once in a while, because not every single game is meant to even run this fast, and some games tie their actual frame rate to the game's logic and cap it, so that's why you're not going to see stuff like Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask be getting any more frames no matter how high you push the overclock, and that's because the games actually lock that frame rate down. But Rare's games are always unlocked, and that's why you're seeing a lot of them in this testing series. And even though I really do enjoy Jet Force Gemini, this is definitely, in my opinion, the way to play. And if you want to see a comparison to the Analogue 3D Overclocked to MiSTer FPGA Overclocked, leave me a comment down below. It is a very time-consuming video to make, and I'm only going to do it if enough people ask me to do it, because I'm not quite sure if people are actually all that interested. But you can see here, absolutely fluid and smooth, the best Jet Force Gemini you're going to see running on N64 hardware outside of MiSTer FPGA. And it's the next soundtrack sample, so listen, and I'll be right back. It sounds great to my ears, and just to dispel a rumor that I mentioned in the previous Analogue 3D overclocking testing video, overclocking N64 hardware does not cause the music or sound effects to speed up whatsoever. They are playing at the exact same rate they would on real hardware, or the exact same rate they would if you weren't overclocking the FPGA core whatsoever. This is dealing with how the graphics draw, how the CPU crunches through a lot of the code, but it isn't really affecting the audio whatsoever, so just keep that in mind. But as far as Jet Force Gemini is concerned, I think it takes it to playable, where I feel like the N64 version was bordering on unplayable in spots in my opinion. Moving over to Banjo-Tooie, again another Rare title. This is one that I think is perfectly fine on stock N64 hardware. You'd get into the high teens to low 20s frame rate wise, and back in the day, that's just kind of what we all got used to. But this one, again, is just going to run that much smoother, and there is actually a performance patch for this as well, but I am not using it for the test. This is just the stock cartridge, and I'm basically running it overclocked. And just so you know, basically every game on this list has been done on real cartridges, not on an Everdrive, even though that doesn't affect anything whatsoever. Just to give you an idea of all the weird random stuff I have in my collection. Banjo-Tooie is just a straight up amazing game. I honestly like it better than the original Banjo-Kazooie, even though I think both of them are incredible. And this cutscene here is Banjo's running up the stairs as the camera's panning. Everything just has a better sensation of fluidity. Now, I don't want you to think that this overclock mode is some sort of silver bullet that is going to make every single game run at a locked 60 frames per second or even higher. You might get to 60 frames per second here and there in games, that maybe ran in the 30s or 40s, but in the games that ran in the teens to 20s, you're probably going to hover in the high 30s to mid 40s, maybe a little bit further up from there, depending on what's actually drawing on the screen. Because remember, with advanced culling and some trickery, you're able to actually get a lot of detail on the screen at once with a decent frame rate. But when the actual GPU side of things in the N64 isn't drawing that much to the screen, it has the overhead to run whatever it is you are looking at a much higher frame rate. So just keep that in mind. Depending on the scene complexity and what's going on in any particular game and any particular scene, you might end up dropping down a little bit of frame rate, still being above the native console frame rate, just because of everything that's going on. And there's a lot of stuff going on in the scene with enemy wise or logic, and that can also bog down the CPU, which can also cause the frames to drop a little bit. But just running around this first open area here in Banjo-Tooie, it absolutely just works for me. It is smooth, it is fluid, and it's going to be a much better experience until Rare finally gets off their asses and gives us Banjo 3. I just want another pure platforming game in the Banjo-Kazooie franchise, but at this point in time I absolutely expect to never see that. But again, as we move around and pan the camera around, just kind of roll through the environment here, everything just kind of feels smooth. I would say we're probably around maybe 30 some odd frames per second. If you told me this was capped at 30 in engine and always just ran that way, I would believe you, but we know that's not the case whatsoever. It even allows Kazooie to shoot a couple more eggs out of you-know-where, and that's definitely something that's going to leave him sore at the end of the day. Let's move over to Gauntlet Legends. This is another fun game, but again, just like the previous video where I talked about Rush 2049, it is a title where there's just better versions of the game out there. I would play the Dreamcast version of the game, I would play the arcade version of the game before we actually went over to N64. But as far as games that absolutely benefit from the overclock, this one I think might actually speed up more than any other game that I have tested so far on Analogue 3D or on MiSTer FPGA on the Turbo N64 core. That is because there really isn't a lot of complexity in the scenery here on something like Gauntlet 64. It doesn't have the best graphics any way, shape, or form, doesn't even get close, but it has a metric crap ton of enemies on screen at once, and that just absolutely bottlenecks the CPU and GPU when it's actually drawing those characters to the screen, trying to get a decent frame rate. That is basically 100% alleviated here. You're going to see everything's fast, everything's fluid, and it's going to be a Gauntlet experience that I would consider playable, because the actual stock core on MiSTer FPGA or Analogue 3D just way too slow in my opinion, especially when the Dreamcast version exists. But it's also going to be the last soundtrack sample of the video, so go ahead and listen for 45 seconds because the music is quite good, and I'll be right back.
Collect gold to buy power-ups.
So if I had to pick one game from this test I like the performance of more than any other one, that would have to be Perfect Dark, and that's just because I think it is the best game as far as first-person shooters are concerned on the N64. I would take Perfect Dark over GoldenEye, but I do love GoldenEye 100%. There's just something about Perfect Dark that kind of feels like that overall concept fully realized in N64. With the performance patch, with the highest overclock on Analogue 3D, you're getting a game that absolutely feels like it wants to get to that 60 frame per second target, and that seems to be like double plus the original frame rate, almost triple in spots of the actual N64 release. But we're done. If you want to see more tests, give me some game recommendations down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Hope you enjoyed the video. Bye bye.